Welcome, Dr. Tafari. Please explain what femicide is and the history of femicide in Jamaica.
Well, femicide is women being murdered because they're women. And how does that work in Jamaica? Well, of course, you'd have to look at our colonial past to understand the vulnerabilities that especially women of African descent have faced in this country. And from the minute that people were captured in Africa, you know, you're about your business and somebody comes and captures you to sell you into slavery. And you're marched overland for over 300, 500 miles in some cases. Can you imagine that? From here to Montego Bay. And then you're incarcerated in a dungeon underneath what is called Cape Coast Castle, built by the Danes. And that's when they occupied Ghana, what we now know as Ghana on the west coast of Africa, for over 200 years before they sold to the British in 1850. And you're underneath this castle for 5.5 months, being stored like objects before being transshipped across the Atlantic for another 3.5 months. And you get to the Caribbean. And both for production and for reproduction, you are exposed to extraordinary violence in every sphere of your life. I mean, I don't know if you've read Thomas Thistlewood's diaries. He documented in a very precise way what took place on plantations, you know, from the seasoning farms where men were routinely sodomized, especially in front of the community to demoralize the community. And women, of course, were routinely raped for both the pleasure and the production purposes that the plantations were purposed for. So when we talk about femicide, the lifespan of someone who experienced enslavement was not more than 20 years, 30 years at the most, and you had children that you saw sold off as objects again for profit. And so emotionally, psychosocially, you experience death on an everyday basis. Never mind what you physically experience by being beaten or starved or raped again or yes, overworked and murdered in so many different ways. If you again read Thomas Thistlewood's diaries, you're shocked at the devices that people invented to defecate in somebody's mouth, for example, and to make sure that they held it there for days before they had to swallow. There are people who experienced that, committed suicide, you know, and women committed infanticide to make sure that their children wouldn't grow up in a system like that. So we have inherited wounds in an epigenetic manner because it has passed down in our genes. And I think that, you know, what we experience now with women being, again, exposed to murder in a very routine way, it wasn't even like that 30, 40 years ago, because when the violence started in the 1960s, it was more of contestation between men. And, you know, it was political violence in the 1970s, coming up to 1980, which was a watershed when some 800 people were killed in political violence, which, of course, is another story. And this is where the two main political parties, the People's National Party and the Jamaica Labour Party, have armed their supporters to fight against each other, ultimately to colonize the votes in enclaves that we now call garrison communities, because, you know, they're politicized so that people of a certain stripe are the ones who benefit from the housing arrangements and that kind of thing. So in the 90s, a pattern emerged where women would be surrogate victims. So, you know, you can't catch Kwaku, you catch him shot, where a man would be the target of another man's violence. And, you know, you can't find him, so you kill his mother or his sister or his child. And so we see this pattern emerging in Jamaica. Until now, women become direct victims themselves. You know, you never can get over the enormity of the incident with Kay Lamont in St. Thomas, where she had been robbed. Telling her sister about it, she was swearing. And the policeman attacked her, killed her. She was pregnant and almost killed her sister too. So you think that there's a line that we have crossed, because the sacredness of life has dissolved, and the indiscriminate kind of killings that we now see shows that we have lost values and attitudes that we were trying to retrieve in the 80s and the 90s, you know, under the P.J. Patterson government. That was a whole big project. But I don't think they succeeded in retrieving that lost sense of decency. So of course we cannot think about femicide in Jamaica without also looking at what has been emerging in terms of women who are partners or family members of men who work as soldiers or police or security guards. And I did actually a study of these kinds of incidents. I collected about 20 stories off the internet. And this was not an exhaustive kind of search, of different instances where partners of persons whose job allow them to have a gun at their disposal have been the perpetrators of murder-suicides. And there was one notable attempt at suicide that didn't work. This policeman from Portland who killed his partner out in the marina. She had left him, and he persuaded her to have a conversation with him in a public space, and apparently she thought it was safe to do so. And right there in the gazebo, he shot her and then shot himself, and fortunately or unfortunately he didn't die. So he actually went to jail, and after 6 years of trial, you know, he was convicted of murdering his partner, which is one of the rare instances when you look in the literature where this attempt at eliminating yourself from the scene of the crime doesn't work. So that bears some studying. And the pattern of ownership of the partners is very consistent in terms of thinking that if this person leaves the relationship, you have to take them out of life. And there was a case of the security guard at the tax office downtown where the partner came in and said, "I'm gonna kill you today." And she said, "Right here in front of everybody?" And he said, "Yes." And 6 shots later, he killed her and then killed himself right there. And there was a case of the woman who was dropping the child to school. And the man came, and right there in front of the child, he killed her and killed himself. So there have been a number of these kinds of instances. You know, the soldier, you know, in Mandeville who, you know, cut his partner's throat and then killed himself similarly. It says to you there's a cowardice at the bottom line, because if you kill yourself, that's the cowardly way out. And if you think that you can have the authority to take somebody's life, that's also a cowardly way out, because you cannot do the strong thing, the man thing, which is to walk away, you know, to deal with your wound and to heal yourself and to try again, because there are thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of persons in life. Why do you think that you have the authority? But you can connect this to the enslavement history, because the fact that we come from a history where our bodies were owned to the extent that they were branded, to the extent that most people still bear the names of their enslavers. And, you know, we as African people are not called Wilson or Patterson or Smith by accident.
Why have killings of women become so rampant in Jamaica?
It is a breakdown in our communication capabilities. You know, this notion of gender-based violence and intimate partner violence is very much topical right now, because people are doing more analysis about how it is that, you know, in relationships, the power that is distributed usually, of course, is a masculine kind of power. And of course, in Jamaica, women are not going to take kindly always to being dominated. It's like that, you know. So the pushback, both in terms of women's socioeconomic advancement, because of course more women are going to acquire higher education, and the more education that you acquire, then the more you are aware of the paradox between accepting this God is the head of man, man is the head of woman kind of hierarchy, which is how we are cultured. That's the kind of teaching that most people are exposed to, because we are a heavily Christianized society. Per capita in the world, Jamaica has the most churches. So, of course, Christianity was one of the mechanisms that colonialism employed for psychosocial control. And it is working to this day, to the extent that people still believe that God looks white, you know, in the way that they were brainwashed to believe in the enslavement system. So, by extension, the whole patriarchal notion that power is masculine and that women should be subordinate to this power is at the root of the violence that happens in the household. And if you look at the statistics, the pattern is that domestic violence is responsible for a lot of the murders that we see happening in the society. So beyond the men who are the chief perpetrators and victims, you also have women being caught up in this web of violence. And it is speaking to the fact that we have not done the healing that should have taken place after 1834, come 1838, when we were so-called emancipated. But then again, we have to contend with all the contradictions, because if we still have the Queen as the head of the state, then we can't really claim that full-fledged emancipation. And so with all this uncertainty about who we are as a nation, who we are as a people, who we are even as individuals, then it is very problematic. People don't work out before they start to have sex and children, whether they can communicate effectively with each other. So then the children enter the picture, and before you know it, you're unemployed, and that's a trigger for violence, especially for men who are supposed to be breadwinners. And if they're not winning any bread, then of course the pressure comes from the woman to say, hey, you're not a real man. And that again can wound his ego, and then he can take it out on her. And again, because of the whole gang violence pattern, you see that again women become direct and indirect victims in this maelstrom of human hemorrhaging that we're hell-bent on doing. And it's out of the control of the security forces, it's out of control of the communities, and I don't know if we have the will, politically speaking, or even in terms of our social dynamics, to fix it. We're a country that is in the top 3 when it comes to murder capitals of the world, El Salvador, Colombia being close seconds, so we have a problem.
Can you please share the history of skin bleaching in Jamaica?
Well, you know, skin bleaching, again, we have to go colonial, you know, because if you are told that black is ugly, you know, anything too black no good is a proverb that the average child grows up knowing the meaning of in a place like Jamaica. You internalize that, that's racism. That is how racism becomes refracted in our system of socialization. So the brown child in the family gets better treatment than the dark-skinned child. It translates into how the child is treated at school, how you're treated in the workplace, how you're treated in the media. I mean, look at the Observer and page 3, and who gets featured, you know? And so the notion that if you're white, you're all right, if you're brown, stick around, if you're black, get back, is something that people have had to contend with in a society that gave value in terms of your freedom to whether you were one color stream or the other. And so, again, we have not decolonized this value system. And we have a situation where, I don't know if you remember when Joan Andrea Hutchinson went on television as someone who bumped up her hair, and people were calling from uptown saying, take that bumpy head gal off the TV. And she, being a person who critically reflected on the society through comedy, made a whole commentary on that. You know, that bumpy head gal, she made a tape back in the days of making tapes. But it also was a serious refraction and resistance to the dominance of the voice of the sector of the society that we call socially white, or the brownings, you know, the ones who are entitled to have that opinion and have it reproduced into how we organize the society, unfortunately. So the notion of bleaching, you know, back in the day, maybe 40 years ago or more, people used to just use Ambien, Nadinola, and it was just seen as, you know, you just want to tone out your skin a little bit. But now the rampant use of these imported gels and creams and rubbings and all these paraphernalia that people use to change their complexion from black to brown. And this architecture of transforming one's look is supported by the merchants who encourage this practice by bringing the products in. And so you have to wonder at a society that doesn't cauterize the practices that are alien to a sense of self-making, a sense of elevating oneself in a development, in a sustainable development kind of way. This is something that is leaving people behind, whereas the UN, the United Nations, has a mantra that says, leave no one behind. So we need to be more intentional about speaking out, acting out, making policy that will prevent people from harming themselves, because melanin is something that enables us to use our pituitary gland for producing and reproducing our intelligence. Now, when you deracinate your skin using skin bleaching products, and when you use chemicals to straighten your hair, not only is it disfiguring you in terms of how you look, but it is also sending a message that you have no value, that you don't value what your contribution is to this world in terms of your own embodiment and your own interaction with other people in the society. The fact that your self-concept is hinged to a racialized platform, a racialized model of how we should look, then you know, people are now so hooked on weaves and these kinds of artificial self-representations that you don't quite know who a person is. So when you hear the police describing a wanted person and saying the person is of a bleached complexion, then you know that we're really twisted in our interpretations of who we are.
How important was and is the griot to African cultures?
Oh, so the griot is the storyteller. The griot is the person who keeps the memory of the community alive in their minds. And I don't know if you remember the story of Kunta Kinte in Roots, and how the stories are passed down from generation to generation, and that is how we connect with the ancestors who are with us symbolically from the past, who guide us in the present, and therefore who are with us in the future. So it's a lateral sense of engagement with time, in opposition, therefore, to the Western notion of commodifying time, like time is money, don't waste it. We engage with time through the memories. And unfortunately, a lot of our memories have been erased because of this intentional brainwashing that we have gone through the colonial experience, which is a Holocaust in and of itself, called the Maafa. It's a Swahili word that means total disaster. And so you cannot tell the average Jamaican right now that they are African, even though 90% of the population is predominantly of African descent. You can tell the Indian that they are Indian, and they have a clear sense of what Indianness looks like and feels like. And we even absorb that because you know, of course, what dal and bath is, you know, that's the kind of food coming from there and where Indian communities are. If you ask about Chinese, people are very clear about who Chinese are, whether it's the old Chinese or the new Chinese in Jamaica. It's a very clear sense of identity. If you ask who the Jews are, you have no notion, the Syrians. But you ask about the Africans, and then people look sideways at you and wonder if you're going mad and have a retort ready for you to say, no, but you're Jamaican. But if you came from Africa as corn and are planted in Jamaica or Trinidad or Tobago, you don't become peas, you're still corn. So it is, again, a disconnect between our past selves and our sense of history, and the loss of that sense to the reconstruction of ourselves in other people's image and likeness, and therefore that's the recipe for cognitive dissonance, a sort of madness in fact.
Please explain how Africans maintain African spirituality after being enslaved in the Caribbean.
Oh, African spirituality is a big part of our resistance package. If you look, for example, at what happened in Haiti, in Cuba, in Trinidad and Tobago, the Orishas maintained a connection with Igbo belief systems. So even though they outwardly converted to Catholicism and praised the saints, apparently, it was a cover-up for behind the scenes maintenance of awareness and worship of Olodumare, of Ogun, Oshun, Shango, Obatala, Yemaya, the goddess of the ocean, who guided our spirits across as we made that transition from Africa to the Caribbean, you know. She's called Yamoja in Brazil. And the maintenance of this belief system, even when you look in the South, in the South Carolinas, there's this commonality of maintaining this connection to Africa through that recognition that our beliefs were not just arrested and decimated rather, as the popular narrative says in the slavery experience. We actually had mechanisms of keeping the drum alive even when it was banned. You know, people still understood the messages that were being conveyed through that drumming, that talking drum. And when you look at Kumina in St. Thomas, for example, where Africans came the longest and the latest, that ability to still maintain that spirit possession practice to this day is a demonstration that intergenerationally we can still hold on to a sense of who we are under the most dire of circumstances. And Pocomania is a next fusion that shows us that, you know, interweaving of African beliefs in the Christian tradition and maintaining that African flavor. You know, Rastafari has come as an indigenous kind of perspective to show that, you know, you can intentionally also claim that your God and your King comes from Ethiopia, and without apology make that assertion, in spite of the fact that in a colonial context people were charged for sedition and being insane and thrown into the madhouse for this kind of announcement. That's what Leonard Howell actually experienced as the first Rasta in Jamaica. So the fact that you can transcend your circumstances. I went to the Virgin Islands, for example, and this was pretty remarkable for me, that in spite of this transition into the Caribbean, people still brought the seeds of the baobab tree with them. You know, the baobab tree is a tree that once you plant it, it doesn't start bearing under 100 years. And then it remains bearing forever. And the fruit and the powder from the fruit that you get is very nourishing, very sustaining to the body. Now, people who were taken from the continent still brought those seeds with them. There were 25 trees of the baobab variety when I went there, and there was a woman who was the spiritual keeper of these trees, because it demonstrated that connectivity, that sense of resistance, because these trees, when you look at them, they're so massive that when you hollow out the trunk, 40 of us could stand in that hollow, to show you the strength and power of those trees. So they brought those trees to bear witness to the fact that we came from another place, another space, another time, and that our sense of resistance has connection to nature. You know, so the fact that you're able to make that move to not just be in this temporal space, but to also be extra temporal, metaphysical. It's very powerful, and the fact that our dance movements in the West can be connected, because that's what Lantonette Steins did with Lakadko. When people used to do butterfly, she went and compared how people danced in West Africa and with the butterfly that people spontaneously produced in Jamaica in the dancehall space, and the moves were the same. And when I see how the Anansi stories that we tell in Jamaica are the same Anansi stories in Suriname, in Ghana, we say poto poto and chaka chaka. We even maintain some of the language patterns. We haven't entirely lost it. And what we need to do is make more efforts, especially through learning a language, to make the connection. Because when I learned Swahili, then I was able to open doors to understand what people were saying on the other side. And I think, for the next generation's sake, we have to open back those doors.
Can you provide some examples of traditional African spirituality in modern Jamaican society?
And even the ways in which we treat with birth and naming and death, some of these rituals are very much still connected to our past. So for example, I grew up in rural Jamaica, where before it was popular to take people to the morgue, people used to put ice on the bodies, and people would dance around the bodies, and that I understand, people in Africa do the same thing. They wash the bodies, they perform rituals like that. And for the 9 nights of the transition that one makes from this life to the other life, the pattern of people singing, eating certain kinds of food. In fact, the food that is cooked is spirit food in a lot of instances here, right here in Jamaica, in some of those rituals. The people don't put salt in it because spirits don't eat salt, and the people want white rum and that kind of alcohol engagement. If you even notice how the National Dance Theatre Company used to perform Kumina, when Rex Nettleford was alive, he engaged with the dance to convey that maintenance of our spiritual connection, and the white rum that is a product of the plantation was still also a conduit for engaging with the spirit world. And if you know what also took place before the Haitian Revolution, Dottie Bookman was a Jamaican spirit master who traveled from Jamaica to Haiti and assisted in the performance of a ritual, a voodoo ritual that was a part of the rite de passage into the revolution, which of course took 12 years to happen. But it showed you how, even from a fighting perspective, the spirits were invoked as part of that resistance movement, so that the connection to the other planes of life have never been abandoned entirely, even though we have been so Christianized. So to even look at how people make dukana, I went to Africa and I was amazed to see that people wrapped the cornmeal mixture in the banana leaf in the same manner. And so through food culture, through other forms of everyday rituals, you know, through prayer, through belief in a higher being. This didn't come from a Western point of view. The notion that Olodumare and the pantheon of gods that we have even lost the names of were spirits that were available to the living on an everyday basis that people could communicate with, is something that I think we still maintain and unfortunately have lost in many quarters. And you know, the fact that Nanny was reputed to be able to bounce bullets off her buttocks is not just a myth, it's a capacity that the Maroons maintained also to have that spiritual communication with the higher powers. So I think that, you know, yes, the more things change, the more they certainly remain the same.
Do you believe Nine Night has an influence on Jamaica's tradition of late night partying?
Right, so I don't know if you also remember the set girls. The set girls were on the plantation, orchestrated to entertain the Bakamasa, yes, so the women had to come out and dance for their edification. And there's a part of the ritual that they engaged in as a disguise, because sometimes when they were planning rebellions and resistance and runaways and so on, they would use those occasions as cover to distract from what the real operation was. And so even though they were supposed to be like these sex objects in these dances, they were also using it as a time, you know, of course, if you're engaged in back-breaking work for 14, 15, 16 hours a day, dancing is a big relief. So, you know, it's sometimes what this woman called, Denise Candioti calls, bargaining with patriarchy in that sense. So it's bargaining with domination, bargaining with oppression, to carve out a little time for yourself, just like how the weekend markets was a time that was carved out for people to sell their own produce, to make their own money, to have their own time for themselves, their own bodies for themselves, for a little time. So we have to see these rituals in a contradictory sense, in a kind of hybrid, dual sense. What were people thinking of when they were working? People actually broke the machinery in order to make them not work, to give themselves a little time. And if you notice our engagement with rain, when rain falls, people don't want to go to work. And it's something in our collective memory that says that was the one little time that you'd get a little time for yourself, you know? It has to do with also the resistance that young people have to agriculture, because something in their memory says this is backbreaking, awful, soul-wrenching kind of work. And so there's this resistance to farming, even though it can sustain you, it could bring you food, but it is not that experience in our DNA. And we need, again, to expunge those kinds of hostilities. Because again, I refer to the evidence coming out from epigenetic research, and I'm in one of these groups in, well, it's based in the States now, but they just produced a report on how it is that we have to start healing ourselves by going into our genes, into our DNA, into our memories, into our social practices, and re-engineering ourselves. Because again, the mass pattern that we have in Chicago, in the shanty towns of Brazil, in the ghettos of Kingston, the pattern is too similar in terms of our self-annihilation for it not to be significant. Why it is that we're imploding like this. And so if you talk about the Nine-Night as a space where we can channel that kind of reconnection, then we should also develop other similar models. And yes, it has been a way that we translate into the partying, because night used to go on from, this time of the evening at dusk, and it wouldn't end till daybreak. And look at Pasa Pasa. You're probably too young to know about Pasa Pasa, but there you have it. From Wednesday night into Thursday morning, that similar, all-night ritual. Somehow our spiritual and our material selves exult in that kind of relief, in that kind of release from the humdrum everyday hardships. And you create a sense of another space, another reality in that. Jollification, whether it is the Raytown or the dance hall or, the night, then we have a space. And that's the pity that we had all these lockdowns. You could imagine how people became frustrated at not being able to have that available. And so maybe people went a little bit overboard in partying just for that sense of release. They couldn't manage the lockdown. But there's something in our spirit that needs that kind of connection to music, to movement, to a sense of freedom that we have been denied for too long.
Why do you refer to plantations in the Caribbean as killing fields?
Oh, the killing fields of Europe. And the reason why we call the Caribbean the killing fields of Europe is because that's what happened. Europe has conveniently packaged the past into a kind of amnesia space where they can conveniently forget, because they have benefited from the largesse of our unremunerated labor, speaking ancestrally, and therefore the global north now is developed at the expense of the global south. So people like Emmanuel Wallerstein and Samira Min were the kind of theorists back in the 70s talking about development and underdevelopment being opposite sides of the same coin. And so when you remind Europe about what happened in the Caribbean, they don't want to remember. The CARICOM 10-point reparations plan is there as a talisman to explain that diseases like diabetes and hypertension, which came out of the enslavement experience, has disproportionately affected people of African descent. And the recompense that we seek is not people doling out checks to people, but it is to fix our institutions that have been left in shambles because of this killing fields experience. And the fact that the blind eye is the consistent response when these demands are being met has to do with the fact that there's not a concerted effort on the part of the Caribbean to recover from the killing fields experience, because we're still tied to the umbilical cords of the same colonials that enslaved us. And in fact, there are about 15 colonies in the Caribbean today, from, owned by Britain, France, the Netherlands. So you have Aruba, Bonaire, Curacao, the Cayman Islands, you have the Virgin Islands, you have Puerto Rico, owned by the United States, These colonials will not let go of the killing fields of the Caribbean because it has been very profitable and very strategic position, geographically speaking, for them to own these territories. And with the, of course, comprador complicity of our own leaders. So we have to also detangle these relationships politically, socio-economically, because we still see ourselves as a space for white pleasure. Tourism is packaged in that kind of way. And we're only waiting till COVID passes to try to leverage that once again. So until we can see our Caribbean as a space for our own benefit, it is maintaining that enduring colonial legacy. And we need to ramp up the reparations demands, because our underdevelopment will not be solved until we make this a reality. And so it's not just a one person who should be talking about it. It should be something that as a state, as a nation state, we put on the agenda.